Some musicians make huge leaps in the same time that others barely improve at all, and it's not talent. Research shows that the most successful musicians flat out practice differently, and that is exactly what I've seen with my own students as well. Here are 3 specific strategies you can start using today. Now, the big difference between the most successful musicians and the other ones is in how they dealt with the mistakes that came up in their practice sessions. And note that the most successful ones did not make fewer errors to start with. They started off making the same number of mistakes as everyone else. So this isn't down to a talent thing. It's about an approach to practicing. So the core difference here is not even really that the best musicians dealt with mistakes differently, but they saw mistakes differently in the first place. They had a different attitude to that. So they didn't see them as a bad thing, or that they were bad for making mistakes, or that they're not good enough or anything. Instead, they just saw mistakes as data and an opportunity to improve. Now, these 3 tactics we're about to see are the practical steps of how you do that, how you deal with mistakes differently. But you won't get the benefits from them unless you're able to hold on to that fundamental mindset shift as well and accept the mistakes when they come. So we'll see what the best musicians did differently to get those better results in just a second. But you've got to understand that these better practice techniques are only effective if you're practicing the right things in the first place. And those right things to practice are unique to you. They're different for every musician. So click the link below to download the handy tool I've made that will help you identify exactly the right practice topics for you. And the first thing that the best practicers do differently is to identify the precise location of the error, the thing that's causing them problems. So definitely not playing just the whole phrase and not even playing a small chunk around it, but identifying the exact point where something is going wrong, focusing in on that and very deliberately doing the steps necessary to correct that. But you want to go even further than just identifying what has gone wrong and where that is. You want to look at the underlying why. Why is this going wrong? Because that is not always the obvious thing. So, quick demonstration story from when I was learning to juggle. And I started out thinking that it was all about whether I was able to catch the ball properly. If I dropped the ball, I thought that's a problem with my catching. I need to get better at catching. But if you look at this, hopefully you can see it. When I throw the ball well, this hand here did not have to move at all to catch it. I could pretty much do nothing and the ball's just going to fall in and be there. So the problem then is not, almost always, it's not one of catching. It's did I throw the ball correctly? So I would spend a long time thinking, oh, I've got to get better at catching. And I totally missed the real underlying problem, which was my throwing was not good enough. And it can be exactly the same in music. You look at where the mistake is, and it may be that you tensed up a note or two before, or that you played something in the wrong way before, and that made it really impossible to get to the next note. So just be aware of that. Now, you might be wondering how I know that these are the things that the best practices do differently. And it comes from a mix of sources. So some of it is the mechanism, understanding what happens, like that example with the juggling ball and having to know why something is causing the problem. Some of it is my own experience working with students and seeing what made the difference and what didn't. And there are also some really helpful research studies giving us some nice scientific backing to this. And the particular study that I'm using most today for this video was a really interesting one done by Robert Duke, looking at 17 different pianists. And I just want to say thanks to Noah Kageyama for pointing this study out to me, making me aware of it. And it identified 8 specific things that the people who practiced most effectively did that were different from the others. So not just what are the ones that the best people do, but what are they doing that is different from everyone else who is not being as successful. Now, the second thing that the top practicers do differently is that they took the time to reflect between repetitions. And that appears both in the research study and very much also in my experience. And it also lines up really nicely with all the neuroscience stuff that is coming out, which shows that you need to be definitely paying attention and really clear about what you mean to achieve with training skills. And if you want to go deeper into that, then I made a whole separate video on that with a lot more information, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. And what does this reflection look like in practice? Well, in the research study, the video replays of the practicers showed that they were doing things like just taking silent pauses, they were singing or humming to themselves, they were writing little notes in the margin of their music, there were little verbal comments or ahas. So it doesn't have to be a big formal thing. You're just taking a little bit of time to think about stuff and see what comes up. And it's worth saying here that there are a couple of really interesting findings from the research study. about things that didn't make a difference that you might have thought would be helpful. And the first one is that the best practices, the ones who learned the passage in the study best, they did not practice for longer. And equally, neither did they practice shorter. So they didn't learn it faster than anyone else, but they also didn't spend more time working on it. So this really does suggest that it's not talent at work here. It is genuinely about a different approach to how you practice making all the difference. And the second thing that didn't seem to make a difference is doing more repetitions. Now that's interesting because science does seem to suggest that it's repetitions on the specific bit that needs work that really matters rather than time. So you might have thought that this would actually really make a difference. My guess as to why, and we don't know for sure, is that in a relatively short study, learning a passage, doing the reflection to work out which bits they needed to repeat was more important than just sheer number of repetitions without taking the time to consider that. So my guess is if you did different studies, longer ones, you might actually see that the most effective practices did do more repetitions of the bits that matter. But in this case, that's not what came up. Now, the third thing that the best practices did differently was they practiced at varying speeds. But this was not a random, I'm playing fast sometimes, I'm playing slow at other times. It was very logical decisions about the bits that they found pretty easy. They would practice at faster speeds so they could get through it quicker, the repetitions, and also they're doing it closer to where they're going to have to play it for real. And then when they got onto the tricky bits, they slowed things right down. So they were not trying to do stuff faster than they could. When it was hard for them, they were making it really slow so they could get the basics right. And before speeding up afterwards. So there's a very deliberate varying of speed depending on the requirements of the bit that you're learning. And this helps massively. And I'm afraid I see far too many students of mine just choosing one speed for everything. Do not do that. Be willing to go fast and slow depending on the demands of the bit you're working on. And I have to say, I was really glad to see that the research backs up one of my pet peeves that I'm always going on about, which is that you should be playing with feeling and emotion and stuff right from the start, because it showed that the people who learnt the passage most successfully in the study, they didn't just do it mechanically. They did put that in early on, and definitely you should look to do that. But while those three specific tactics, the things that the top practices did differently, are really useful, it turns out there is a deeper underlying insight that links them all together and will be hugely useful for you to understand, to have that affect the whole way you approach practice. Because when you look at those three different things that they did, it turns out they are all about being thoughtful and having an adaptive approach to practice rather than an inflexible way of just going at things. So it's about finding the mistakes, the things that need the really focused attention, not just kind of plowing through everything and making assumptions at the start and sticking with them. They're seeing what's going on and then they're searching for the bits they need to focus on. It's about varying the tempo, the speed at which they played things, but not just randomly or to a predetermined plan, but in response to how they find as they're working. And it's about taking time to reflect, so to be thoughtful about things and then change their approach as a result of that. So I hope you'll incorporate that thoughtful and adaptive approach into how you do practice generally with everything you do. And if you want to go further into this sort of thing, then check out my Practice Multiplier course, where I go a lot deeper into all these sort of topics and much more besides. And I'll put a link for that in the description below if you're interested.